Black man suffered humiliation when trying to buy a luxury car at a dealership, but when he returned the next day, he left everyone in shock. David Thompson walked into the luxury dealership with a sparkle in his eyes and a smile on his face. It was a sunny morning in Chicago, and he had saved every penny of his salary to buy the car of his dreams, a sports sedan he had always desired. Dressed in a well-tailored suit, he felt confident, ready to finally fulfill his wish. However, as he crossed the glass door of the dealership, the vibrant and welcoming atmosphere he expected quickly dissipated. As soon as he entered, he was greeted by Steve Miller, a middle-aged salesman with an arrogant attitude. Steve glanced at David, quickly sizing him up, and a sarcastic smile appeared on his face. "Can I help you with something, buddy?" Steve asked, his voice laced with condescension. "Or did you just come to admire the windows?" David forced a smile, trying to ignore the implicit disdain in the salesman's words. "Actually, I'm here to buy a car. I'm interested in the sports model you have on display," David replied, maintaining his composure. However, Steve's response was not what he had hoped for. "The sports model? Interesting choice. I hope you have the right budget," Steve said, laughing as he gestured dismissively, as if brushing off a mere whim. He turned his attention to another customer, a white man who had just walked in, ignoring David completely. David's heart sank. He felt like an intruder in a space that was supposedly inclusive and welcoming. He watched as the salesman eagerly catered to the new customer, who was treated with enthusiasm and attention that David had not received. "Here are the best models, sir. You're going to love this one," Steve said, leaning in as if genuinely interested. Frustration began to bubble within David. He stepped back a little, trying to control the anger rising in his chest. "Excuse me, but I would just like to know more about the car I asked about," he said, his voice firm, but feeling the humiliation wash over him. At that moment, Rachel Johnson, the dealership manager, entered the scene. She noticed David's discomfort and Steve's despicable attitude. As a woman who had faced her own battles against prejudice, her heart ached at the sight of a customer being treated with such disdain. Rachel approached, determined to intervene. "Steve, how about you go check out the rest of the showroom? I can help this customer," Rachel said, trying to regain control of the situation. But Steve, with a disdainful look, simply shook his head. "Sure, Rachel. If you think you can sell a car to him, good luck," Steve replied, flashing a sarcastic smile. He walked away, leaving Rachel and David alone. With an apologetic look, Rachel turned to David. "I'm so sorry for what happened. This is not representative of what we want here. How can I assist you?" David took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I just wanted to see the car. I don't understand why I was treated this way. I'm ready to buy, but it feels like I'm not welcome here," he said, indignation evident in his voice. Rachel frowned, clearly disturbed. "This should not happen. I want you to know that we value all our customers. Let's go see the car now. You're going to fall in love with it," Rachel said, trying to rectify the situation. As David followed Rachel toward the car, the humiliation and frustration still lingered over him. He knew it was just a car, but the experience had become so much more than that. It was a painful reminder of how racism still persisted, even in places that should be spaces of equality. What should have been a moment of joy had turned into a silent struggle against injustice. David returned home, his mind swirling with the humiliation he had faced at the luxury dealership. The shine of his dream of owning that car was now overshadowed by the bitterness of the discrimination he had experienced. Upon entering his apartment, he threw his bag onto the sofa and collapsed into a chair, feeling the weight of indignation suffocate him. "I can't let this go," he murmured to himself, looking out the window at the city lights twinkling in the night. He remembered Steve's disdainful look, the contempt in his words. David felt he needed to do something, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced similar prejudices. That night he stayed up late, tossing and turning with thoughts. The idea of revenge began to form in his mind, a plan that was not just about payback, but about exposing injustice. The next day he decided to seek support from his friends. At a local bar, where he often met with a group that always encouraged him, David shared what had happened. "You won't believe what happened. I was treated like I was invisible," David said, his voice heavy with frustration. The friends, seated around the table with beers in hand, listened intently, each realizing the gravity of the situation. "That's unacceptable, man. You have to do something about it," exclaimed Marcus, a longtime friend. "Filing a complaint is the least you can do. But what if they don't believe me? What if I'm just ignored again?" David replied, his insecurities surfacing. Look, you have to think big. It's not just about you, it's about all of us. You could use your law background to sue them. We need to expose this discrimination, said Anna, a friend who had always been a strong advocate for social justice. As the conversation flowed, David's determination grew. He realized he wasn't alone in this fight and that he could count on the support of his friends. After a few rounds of drinks and animated discussions, he decided it was time to act. All right, I'm going to do it. I'll gather evidence and testimonies. I can't let them get away with this, he declared, a new spark in his eyes. In the following days, David immersed himself in research. He spent hours reviewing anti-discrimination laws, gathering information on similar cases, and even revisiting the dealership incognito to observe the interactions of the salespeople with other customers. What he witnessed confirmed his suspicions. Unequal treatment was a common practice. Meanwhile, he began drafting a formal complaint. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by piles of books and notes, he felt stronger with each word he typed. I'm not just a customer. I'm a human being who deserves respect, he murmured to himself as he pressed the keys on his computer. Before we continue with this gripping story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories, and let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. So, one night, after a long and exhausting day, he received a text message from Anna. Shall we meet at the bar tomorrow? You need more support for what's coming. David smiled as he read the message, feeling grateful for such supportive friends. He knew the journey ahead would be long and challenging, but now the possibility of justice was within reach. At the next meeting, David's friends were buzzing with enthusiasm, ready to help him build a solid case. We need testimonies. Did anyone else see what happened? Marcus asked as he looked around the table. I can talk to some people who were there, Anna replied, full of determination. David observed how powerful solidarity could be. He finally felt that he was fighting not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced. He was ready to face the battle, determined to turn his humiliation into a meaningful fight against inequality. And so, with the strength of his friends by his side, David began to chart the path to justice. David sat at a dimly lit table in a bar in downtown Chicago, surrounded by his closest friends. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and loud music, but David's mind was far away, immersed in the humiliation he had faced at the dealership. His friends, noticing his restlessness, tried to cheer him up with jokes and funny stories, but nothing seemed to lift the weight he carried. Man, you can't just let this go, Marcus said, slapping his hand on the table with determination. You're a lawyer. You have to do something about this. I know, David replied, looking down at the beer glass in his hands. But what can I do? They have all the power, and I'm just one man against a giant corporation. It's not just you, David, interjected Sarah, a longtime friend with a fighting spirit. We're with you. We need to bring this injustice to light. You have to sue them. David's expression brightened at the idea. Sue them? Do you think that would work? Of course it will. We need to gather evidence, testimonies. We'll do this together, Marcus said, the excitement rising in the air. Let's fight against this discrimination. The energy in the bar began to shift. David's friends were ready to mobilize, and that gave him a new perspective of hope. All right, David said, feeling more confident. I'll do it. I'll use my training, and I won't let this humiliation go unchallenged. In the following days, David dedicated himself to gathering information. He visited the dealership again, this time as an observer, taking notes on everything he saw. The discriminatory practices he had witnessed before were even more evident than he had imagined. He saw other white customers being treated enthusiastically, while the few black customers were ignored or treated condescendingly. Meanwhile, Rachel Johnson, the dealership manager, wrestled with her own conscience. After what she ate, one night, while reviewing documents at the dealership, she decided to investigate the sales practices. What she found was alarming. Sales records showed a clear pattern of racial discrimination. This can't be happening, she murmured to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. The weight of guilt consumed her, and she knew she had to do something about it. I can't stay silent. Rachel began documenting her findings, realizing that if David decided to sue the dealership, she could be a key witness. But the idea of confronting her superiors terrified her. What if they fire me? What if they sue me too, she thought, but quickly reminded herself of David and what he had faced. I can't let fear stop me from doing what's right. In a secret meeting with a group of activist lawyers, David presented his situation. The atmosphere was charged with tension, but also solidarity. The lawyers were willing to help, and one of them, Carlos, an experienced civil rights advocate, looked into David's eyes and said, "You're not alone in this. We'll prepare a strategy that will not only expose this injustice, but also fight against structural racism." David felt a wave of gratitude wash over him at those words. "Thank you, Carlos. That means a lot to me." "And remember, David," Carlos continued, "every step you take is not just for you, but for everyone who faces the same discrimination. Your fight is the fight of many." David's determination grew. He knew he was facing a monumental battle, but now he had a network of support and allies who believed in his cause. Each day his confidence increased as more people joined him. Rachel, on the other hand, was also preparing for the coming battle, aware that her decision to testify could cost her job, but believing it was a risk worth taking. If not now, when? She asked herself, looking over the documents she had gathered. Change was on the horizon, and she was ready to face the consequences. As night fell over Chicago, Steve Miller sat in his leather chair, a strong drink in hand, trying to unwind after another day at the dealership. However, his mind was far from peaceful. Flashbacks of his childhood haunted him, images of a small boy listening to his father, a rough man full of prejudices, dictate the rules of how the world worked. "You need to know that others will never respect you, Steve. They are different from us. Don't trust them," his father would say in a threatening voice. The boy, only 8 years old, absorbed those words as if they were absolute truths. He remembered how he always felt superior when looking at the other children in the park, those who were different from him. Now, as an adult, Steve found himself repeating those patterns, unaware that life was about to turn against him. The echo of his father's voice still resonated in his mind, but a part of him was beginning to question those beliefs. In that dealership, the humiliation he inflicted on David Thompson was not just a matter of disdain, it was a repetition of a cycle of hatred he had never allowed himself to see. On the other side of the city, in a modestly decorated apartment, David was preparing for the battle ahead. Sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by books on civil rights and anti-discrimination legislation, he couldn't help but feel empowered by his legal education. He knew he held a power in his hands, a power that could not only change his life but also impact the lives of many others. "David, are you really ready for this?" asked one of his friends, Chris, as he scanned the material David had gathered. "I have no choice, Chris. If I don't do this, who will? Discrimination isn't just something that happens to me. It's a disease that infects society as a whole," David replied, his voice firm and resolute. "I'm with you, brother. We're not going to let this go unnoticed," Chris said, placing his hand on David's shoulder. The other friends at the table nodded in agreement, feeling the determination in his words. Meanwhile, Rachel Johnson, the dealership manager, reflected on the situation. She knew she had failed to stand up for David, and her conscience now haunted her. "How could I let that happen?" she murmured to herself, gazing out the window at the illuminated city. At that moment, she decided she needed to take action. If the system was broken, she had to be the change she wanted to see. That night, Rachel began investigating the dealership's practices. In her search, she uncovered a series of documents revealing patterns of systematic discrimination. The sales reports clearly showed that white customers were given preferential treatment. "This is unacceptable," she exclaimed, speaking aloud to herself in her office. She knew she had to do something about. "Rachel, you can't do this. You're putting your career at risk," warned a colleague who entered her office and found her reviewing the documents. "And what do you suggest? That I close my eyes and pretend nothing is happening? I can't do that anymore. It's not just about me, it's about everyone who has been treated this way," she replied, her passion evident in her voice. Meanwhile, David continued to delve into the legislation. He remembered how his professors in law school always encouraged him to fight against injustices. "The law is a powerful tool, David. Use it to do good," his constitutional law professor once told him. "I will, Professor. I promise," David murmured to himself as he flipped through pages containing crucial information. He was determined to use his skills not only for revenge, but to expose a failing system. That night, David and Rachel found themselves on opposite sides of a battle that had yet to begin, but both were resolved to confront their personal demons. David was preparing to fight for justice, while Rachel was becoming an unexpected ally, determined to right the wrongs of the past. Change was on the horizon, and the city of Chicago would be the stage for this transformation. David and his friends gathered at a cafe in downtown Chicago, a place that used to be a refuge for them, but now carried a different weight. The walls were adorned with photographs of the city, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sound of animated conversations. But that afternoon the atmosphere was charged with tension. David, his gaze fixed on a laptop at the table, was reviewing the evidence he had collected. The spotlight of justice was beginning to shine, but he knew the battle was just starting. "We need to be strategic," David said, his voice steady yet laced with concern. "It's not just about winning the case. We need to expose this discrimination so that others feel encouraged to fight too." Maya, a longtime friend and one of the activist lawyers who joined him, nodded. "I agree. If we can make this public, we can create a movement. We're not just fighting for you, David. We're fighting for everyone who has suffered this injustice. And how are we going to do that?" Carlos, another friend, asked, crossing his arms and looking intently at David. "The media can be a double-edged sword. They might distort our message." "Yes, but they also have the power to amplify it," Maya replied. "We need a press conference. If we can get David's story to a larger audience, the pressure on the dealership will increase." David took a deep breath and nodded, feeling determination swell within him. "All right, then let's plan this. We need a location, a date, and a strategy. I want my story to be heard, not just as a complaint, but as a call to action." As they discussed, the energy at the table began to shift. Ideas started to flow, and the conversation transformed into a vibrant brainstorming session. They spent hours scribbling plans on napkins and discussing the key points David should address. The next day, the press conference was scheduled for Grant Park, where Chicagoans often gathered. David felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. He was about to become the voice for many who lacked the courage to speak out. On the morning of the conference, reporters and cameras began to swarm, and David felt his heart race. "Remember, David, you're not alone," Maya whispered beside him, sensing the tension in his shoulders. "We're all here with you." When it was time to speak, David positioned himself in front of the microphone, feeling the gazes of hundreds of people and journalists focused on him. He took a deep breath before beginning. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm here to share my story, but more importantly, to talk about something that affects many of us: racial discrimination." He looked at the audience, feeling the vibrant energy around him. "Recently, I was treated with disdain and disrespect at a car dealership. What should have been a moment of achievement turned into a humiliating experience, simply because of the color of my skin. And this isn't just my story. It's the story of many who face discrimination every day." David's words echoed through the park, and the crowd began to stir, some even applauding. "We need to unite against racism and discrimination. We must demand change and accountability from those who perpetuate these injustices. We cannot and will not remain silent." The press conference drew local media attention, and soon David's case became a topic of conversation throughout the city. He felt something powerful was happening. Messages of support began pouring in, and people from different backgrounds shared their own stories of discrimination. Maya, by his side, smiled. "You did it, David. People are listening." "Yes, and this is just the beginning," he replied, looking at the crowd that supported him. "We need to continue the fight. This is our chance to make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has suffered in silence." In that moment, David felt that he was not just fighting for a personal victory, but for a fairer and more equitable future. He was ready to face the battle ahead, and with the support of his friends and allies, he knew he was on the path to provoke real change. David was sitting in his living room, the dim light from the lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. He glanced at the phone vibrating on his desk, a sense of foreboding washing over him that it was bad news. When he answered, the voice on the other end was hoarse and threatening. "David Thompson?" the voice said, sending a chill down his spine. "You're playing with fire by suing the dealership. You'd better think twice before you go through with this." David felt his heart race. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure, but anger began to bubble within him. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you don't want to get into more trouble than you already are. Let it go, or the consequences will be severe." He hung up, his hand trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on the window, where the night grew darker, reflecting his mounting concern. He knew he was dealing with something larger than himself, but he wouldn't be intimidated. He realized it was a test of his determination. Meanwhile, at the dealership, Steve Miller was in a tense meeting with upper management. He leaned back in his chair, trying to hide his nervousness. "We need to control this situation before it spirals out of control," he said, his voice a bit lower than usual. "Do you really think we can just ignore the pressure from the media and the public?" one of the directors questioned, raising an eyebrow. "David Thompson has become a symbol now. If we don't act quickly, we could lose customers, and that's the last thing we need." Steve crossed his arms, trying to maintain his posture. "What do you suggest, a settlement? We offer him a sum of money to keep quiet. That might work, but if he doesn't accept, we'll need a plan B. Rachel, you need to make sure the team isn't getting too involved in this case," the director said, looking directly at Rachel Johnson, who was sitting at one end of the table. Rachel, who had remained silent until then, felt a knot in her stomach. She knew what had happened to David was wrong, and the idea of paying to silence someone made her feel nauseous. "I can't support this," she said, her voice firm. "We need to be transparent and face the consequences of what we've done." Steve looked at her, frustration evident on his face. "And you think being honest will help the company? What you saw can't be ignored, but we need to protect our interests. You aren't seriously thinking about going against the company, are you?" "If necessary, I will go against the company," Rachel replied, standing up. "And don't come at me with that line about protecting interests. What happened to David is a disgrace and I can't stay silent." The tension in the room was palpable. Steve bit his lower lip, realizing he was losing the battle. "You're going to regret this," he murmured to himself, while the others in the room exchanged worried glances. That night, David gathered with his friends at a local cafe. The atmosphere was one of camaraderie, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. "I received a call today," he began hesitantly. "Someone threatened me because of the lawsuit." "Why are you surprised?" a friend said, shaking his head. "They're going to try everything to silence you, but you can't give up now." "I'm not giving up," David affirmed, with renewed determination. "I can't let fear control me. What happened to me was not just a personal offense. It's a reflection of what many face daily. If I don't fight, who will?" "We're with you, David," another friend said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll do this together." Meanwhile, Steve, in his frustration and desperation, decided to try something more radical. He sent a message to an acquaintance, someone he knew could help him contact a juror. "If I can sway the verdict, this pressure goes away," he thought, becoming increasingly consumed by fear. But he had no idea that the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he could never imagine. David's fight was just beginning, and the truth would always find a way to the surface. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. David Thompson sat in his chair, surrounded by friends and allies who had supported his fight from the beginning. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety that pulsed in his chest. It was the moment he could finally expose the injustice he had suffered. The judge entered the room and everyone stood in respect. David watched intently as the judge took his seat, his eyes fixed on Steve Miller, who sat on the other side. The salesman still wore an arrogant expression, as if he were certain he could escape the consequences of his actions. David couldn't let that happen. The first witness was called, and David prepared to hear the statements that could define his future. With his heart racing, he looked at the defense attorney, who began to question the first witness. The attorney asked technical questions, trying to undermine the witness's credibility, but David knew he had the truth on his side. Then it was David's turn to be called. He stood up and walked toward the witness stand, his heart pounding. He turned to the jury, and in a moment of vulnerability, began to share his story. "Honestly, I never expected to be treated that way. I just wanted to buy a car, a dream I had for years." His voice trembled, but he continued. "However, what happened to me at the dealership was something I cannot accept. I was treated as if my skin color defined my worth." The room fell silent, and David felt he had touched the emotions of the jury. The defense attorney, however, was not willing to let that go unchallenged. He stood up and, with a disdainful smile, began to question David. "So, are you saying that you think racial discrimination was the only reason you weren't treated like the other customers?" David took a deep breath and replied firmly, "It's not just a supposition. So es tuntis. It's a fact and I have proof of it." He looked directly at the attorney, his gaze challenging. "I saw other clients being treated with respect and attention, while I was ignored. This isn't just a perception. It's a reality that many of us, black people, face every day." The attorney tried to discredit David, insinuating that he was just seeking attention. "Do you really believe that a luxury dealership, which invests so much in its image, would risk its business because of prejudice?" "That's exactly what happens frequently," David replied, his voice now stronger. Structural racism is embedded in many institutions, and this is no exception. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern that needs to be broken. At that moment, the judge signaled for David to calm down. "Let's keep order here, please," he said, his voice firm. David nodded, but his determination only grew. Soon it was Rachel Johnson's turn, the dealership manager, to be called to testify. Everyone in the room knew she was a key piece of the puzzle. Rachel entered the courtroom with a determined posture, but her heart was racing. She looked at David, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Rachel, were you present on the day David Thompson entered the dealership?" The prosecution's attorney began, his voice clear and firm. "Yes, I was," Rachel replied, her voice resonating in the room. "I saw what happened, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt that David was treated unfairly and disrespectfully." The defense attorney, realizing he was losing control of the situation, tried to divert the focus. "You didn't care to intervene, did you? You were there, but you did nothing." Rachel took a deep breath, facing the accusation. "In that moment, I hesitated, but that doesn't diminish what happened to David. I recognize that I should have spoken up, and I am here now to correct that mistake." The room fell silent, and David felt a mix of relief and gratitude. Rachel's testimony could be the key to showing the court the true face of the discrimination he had suffered. He watched as the jurors exchanged meaningful glances, clearly impacted by what they heard. The judge, in turn, seemed to be absorbing every word, and the tension in the air heightened. David knew that the truth was slowly emerging, and he was determined to fight for justice. The courtroom was in almost reverent silence, the tension palpable. David Thompson, standing beside his attorneys, felt the weight of every gaze directed at him. The judge, a middle-aged man with an unperturbed expression, watched closely as the final arguments were presented. David took a deep breath, recalling the journey that had brought him here, and prepared for what would come next. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David began, his voice firm but laden with emotion, "today I speak not just for myself. I speak for all those who have been silenced, disrespected, and treated as if they are unworthy of dignity. Racial discrimination is not just an isolated incident, it is a practice that has unfortunately taken root in many sectors of our society." He looked into the eyes of the jurors, seeking connection. "When I entered that dealership, I was not just a customer. I was a man who dreamed of acquiring the car of my dreams, a symbol not only of status, but of personal achievement. And yet I was treated as if my presence was a nuisance. I am not here merely to seek financial compensation. I am here to affirm that all of us deserve respect, regardless of the color of our skin." The atmosphere in the room was electric. He could feel the support of his friends and allies who were present in the audience, and even Rachel's presence, who had become a valuable witness in his case. She watched with admiration as David continued his speech. "Steve Miller ignored me, disrespected me, and made jokes about my appearance. But what he didn't know is that his arrogance and prejudice have no place in our society anymore. Each of us has the right to be treated with dignity. And that is why I am here to ensure that the truth prevails." The judge, who had listened attentively, signaled for David to finish. "Very well, Mr. Thompson, we appreciate your testimony. Now let's hear the defense." Steve stood up, his face pale and tense, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what David says is exaggerated. He is trying to turn a simple sales interaction into a racism case. There is no discrimination here. This is just a matter of bad luck." Frustration grew inside David as he listened to Steve's words. He knew the truth was on his side, and it was about to be confirmed. "Mr. Miller," David interrupted firmly, "this is not just a matter of bad luck. It's about recognizing the reality of how some of us are treated, and you are going to hear the truth about your actions." At that moment, Rachel stood up. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "I am Rachel Johnson, the dealership manager," she began, her voice resolute. "I was there. I saw how David was treated, and it is undeniable that discrimination occurred. He deserves a chance to be heard, just like any other customer." Rachel's words echoed through the room, and David felt a wave of hope. She was on his side, and that meant the world to him. The judge encouraged her to continue. "Please go on, Ms. Johnson." Rachel took a deep breath, her determination shining through. "As soon as I realized what was happening, I felt guilty for not intervening. The practice of discrimination at our dealership was evident, and I can no longer remain silent. I cannot allow injustice to prevail." Steve, visibly agitated, tried to argue, but his words were drowned out by the truth being exposed. The judge gave him a serious look. "Mr. Miller, this is not a matter that can be ignored. Discrimination is a crime that we cannot tolerate." The room filled with murmurs, and David felt his heart race. The judge then turned to the jury. "Based on the evidence and testimonies presented, I decide that this case deserves due consideration." David's eyes sparkled with hope. He knew the truth was prevailing, and it would only be a matter of time before justice was served. The judge prepared to make a final announcement, but before he did, David made one last plea to the jury. "Please, do not judge solely based on appearances or the words of the defendant. Judge with your hearts for the dignity that we all deserve." And so, as the courtroom prepared for the judge's final words, David knew that regardless of the outcome, he had fought for the truth and for the respect that everyone deserved. He took a deep breath, feeling that in any case he was making history. After the trial, the courtroom was filled with a palpable energy. David Thompson felt the weight of victory on his shoulders, but also the responsibility that came with it. He left the courthouse surrounded by friends and supporters congratulating him. The murmur of voices and laughter mixed with the exhilarating atmosphere that filled the air. However, amid all this, there was a new path to tread. David looked at his friends, a broad smile on his face. "You have no idea what this means to me. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who has faced discrimination. Now we can make a difference." "You're a true hero, David," exclaimed Jamal, one of his best friends, his eyes shining with pride. "Your courage will inspire many. But we can't stop here," David replied, his expression turning more serious. "We need to use this victory for something greater. I want to help those who are still fighting, who don't have a voice." It was then that, amid the celebration, a representative from a civil rights organization approached. Anna, a woman with curly hair and a determined gaze, said, "David, your speech was powerful. We are creating an advocacy program and would like you to join us as a leader. You have the knowledge and passion to make a real change." David hesitated for a moment. He had dreamed of being a successful lawyer at a big firm, but what he truly desired now was to use his skills to fight against injustices. "It's an honor, Anna. I accept. I want to dedicate my life to helping others rise up." In the following days, David began working in his new role. He met with other activists, discussing strategies and planning campaigns to raise awareness about racial discrimination. Each meeting was a new opportunity for learning and growth, and he felt more motivated every day. Meanwhile, Rachel Johnson, the manager of the dealership who had become an ally, was also facing her own changes. She decided to leave her job, feeling that she could no longer be part of a system that allowed such injustices. In a heartfelt conversation, Rachel found David at a local cafe. "David, I want to thank you. Your courage inspired me to take action. I'm leaving the dealership," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I want to dedicate my time to fighting against discrimination. I can no longer stay in a place that perpetuates this." David looked her in the eyes, surprised and admiring. "Rachel, that's incredible. Your voice is important. We need people like you who are willing to stand up against what is wrong." Rachel smiled, a mix of gratitude and determination. "I want to join you in your efforts. Let's do this together." With Rachel's support and that of other activists, David began to structure the foundation he had envisioned. He wanted to create a space where victims of discrimination could find legal, emotional, and community support. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to impact lives. In one of their meetings, while discussing the next steps, David stood up, his voice strong. "We are here to make a difference. We cannot allow what happened to me to happen to anyone else. Let's work together to ensure that everyone has access to justice." David's words echoed in the room, energizing everyone. The foundation began to take shape, and the idea of a fairer future felt closer than ever. Rachel, by his side, watched the man who had become a symbol of resistance. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they were ready to face it together. As the sun set on the horizon, David looked around, feeling grateful to have found allies on his journey. He had not only overcome the humiliation he had suffered, but had also found a greater purpose. The fight against racism and discrimination had become his mission, and he was determined to make a difference. David was radiant after the unanimous verdict in his favor. The atmosphere of the press conference was charged with expectation and hope. Reporters crowded around, holding microphones and cameras, eager to capture every word from the new icon of the fight against racial discrimination. He positioned himself at the podium, confidence radiating from every gesture. Looking at the audience, he saw familiar faces among friends and advocates, their expressions reflecting pride and solidarity. "Today is not just a personal victory," David began, his voice steady. "It is a victory for all those who have ever been silenced and disrespected because of the color of their skin. This decision is not just mine. It is a collective shout against the injustice that permeates our society." He paused, allowing his words to resonate in the room. "I am excited to announce that with the help of generous allies, I am creating a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of racial discrimination. Together, we can make a difference." Applause echoed through the room, and David smiled, feeling strengthened by the crowd's energy. Among the reporters, a young woman with a notebook raised her hand. "David, how do you feel knowing that your fight may inspire others to stand up against discrimination?" "I feel honored," David replied, the sparkle in his eyes revealing his emotion. "If my experience can serve as a beacon of hope for others, then my struggle will have been worth it." Each of us has the power to change the narrative and transform lives. However, as the applause began to fade, a whisper of tension started to spread. One of the more experienced reporters, known for his keen investigative skills, interrupted the euphoria. "David, there are rumors that Steve Miller, the salesman who discriminated against you, may have tried to interfere with the trial. Do you have any information about that?" David frowned. "What do you mean by interfere? What more could happen amid so much injustice?" "Sources indicate he may have attempted to bribe a juror," the reporter said, his voice heavy with gravity. "If this is true, not only the trial, but the entire judicial system could be under threat." David's heart raced. This revelation could change everything once again. Deep down, he knew that the fight was far from over. The press conference slowly dispersed, but the news about Steve soon spread like wildfire. David remained behind the table, reflecting on the complexity of the situation. He wanted to believe that justice would prevail, but now there was a new layer of challenge to face. Days later, as David was reviewing documents for his new foundation, the phone rang. It was Rachel, his ally and friend. "David, you won't believe what I found out. The investigation into the bribery has been confirmed. Steve is being prosecuted for corruption," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is unbelievable," David replied, feeling a mix of anger and satisfaction. "Finally, he will have to face the consequences of his actions." "Yes, and I'm willing to testify again if necessary. We cannot let him get away with this," Rachel asserted, determined. The conversation was interrupted when David saw the news on television. The image of Steve being led away in custody by the police was something he had never imagined he would see. His face was pale, and the arrogance he used to display had vanished, replaced by fear. "He's finally getting what he deserves," David murmured to himself, the feeling of revenge mingling with a deep sense of justice. Time passed, and at a gala event supporting David's new foundation, he gave a powerful speech filled with hope and determination. With a smile on his face, he took a deep breath, ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that together they could shape a better future. We've reached the end of this touching story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Right now there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these moving stories, just click on it to start. And now, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave a like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video,